has the potential to be a very high value, very high margin opportunity for New Zealand. A significant source of future prosperity for the nation, but we do lack the national will, or to date we've lacked the national will to harness it. There's all sorts of, we're doing our little piece, we've got a emissions trading scheme, whether it's the optimal one or not, we've got other organisations doing little things. No one is putting a cohesive framework around this and saying how do we project ourselves on the world stage. So let me take it to that next step and talk about the subject of long-haul international services into Wellington. They are technically problematic and actually commercially disastrous for Air New Zealand, and let me just walk through that for you. We've just had Boeing actually complete a study which was shared with Wellington Airport. They're going through it at the moment, which has determined that the 787, when it arrives and we get delivery in 2012, would be severely payload restricted out of Wellington at the current runway length, and that would restrict the flight envelope to Australia and the Pacific Islands for that wide body service. Those flight limitations could be addressed by lengthening the Wellington runway by 400 metres. However, for what would most likely at best be a daily service, the economics of that runway extension for that level of service looks cost prohibitive. For us at Air New Zealand, irrespective of how Wellington Airport see that issue, there's a bigger commercial risk, and actually I believe it's bigger than Air New Zealand. I think it's a risk for New Zealand. As I mentioned earlier, we operate our international hub out of Auckland. So what we do is we aggregate all our domestic traffic into Auckland, and then we fly to 11 long-haul destinations out of Auckland. And the reverse holds true for the traffic we bring into the country through Auckland, then feed onto those domestic services. On average, our services operate at a 75 to 80% load factor, and we operate at about a 5% EBIT margin. As you'd realise from those numbers of 4.8 billion of revenue and 4.7 billion of costs, we're a bit below our normal EBIT margin at the moment. So let's assume for a moment we lengthen that Wellington runway by 400 metres, and Air New Zealand commenced a daily service to Singapore, for example, and you could choose Singapore or Hong Kong, and we were flying a 787 with 250 seats. We'll just use Singapore for now. Currently today there's demand for 100 seats between New Zealand and Singapore. That's people originating in one of those locations with the destination being the other location. Singapore Airlines operate a service out of Auckland and Christchurch, and they'll capture the lion's share of this business because the majority of the passengers flying into Singapore are not stopping in Singapore, they're going to onward destinations. They might be going to Japan, China, Japan, Europe, wherever. And because Singapore Airlines operates all those onward services, then naturally they'll get first choice of those customers. It's the way that works. So let's assume that this new service from Wellington to Singapore carries 30 of those 100 passengers that are flying just to Singapore or just from Singapore. The remaining 200 odd seats are going to be sold to passengers flying to those onward destinations. It's highly probable that a number of those passengers would have previously flown up to Auckland and flown on Air New Zealand services to China or Hong Kong or Japan or Europe or wherever they're going on to from Singapore. All we need is for 5% of the traffic to be drawn off those currently profitable services and fly direct out of Wellington, and we end up potentially with a whole series of multiple services that now don't make money. And we have the additional cost of flying a service out of Wellington. The consequence of that then is we either have to push up our fares on all those other services out of Auckland to compensate for that, or we have to start reducing our capacity to recognise the fact that those services are no longer profitable because we've creamed the small volume of passengers that actually make those services profitable off into this route that now goes to Singapore. Worse than that, we've actually gifted a whole bunch of revenue to Singapore Airlines or whoever operates out of that hub, who is now going to carry those passengers onto those end destinations. So pretty quickly you can see that it doesn't make any sense for Air New Zealand to cannibalise a series of profitable services to create a single long-haul service out of Wellington to feed into one of our competitors' networks. And the reason I wanted to go through that logic is, you'll see from time to time this issue emerge in the papers and in the media. There's a technical issue, but there's a very sound commercial issue. Whilst Air New Zealand, it does not make sense for Air New Zealand to operate that service. And in fact, my view is that if another airline operated that service, it would actually cause quite a bit of harm to the potentially a significant proportion of the destinations we fly out of Auckland to today. And I'm not sure, therefore, that proposal is in the best interests of the New Zealand tourism industry as a whole, albeit we may shift some value from one region in New Zealand to another region, being Wellington. So my hope, as I sit here in the role I'm in, and Charles opened by talking about the arrival of a new government, my hope is that as a relatively small nation, with, to be honest, not that many natural advantages, that we can open a dialogue and we can get a genuine cohesiveness in terms of looking at how we as a country and we as New Zealanders work collaboratively and collectively to enhance the prosperity and the prospects for New Zealand as a nation, and put aside some of our specific, sometimes parochial and factionalised interests to present New Zealand on the world stage. There are some great examples. I referred to Emirates before. I think Dubai is a fantastic example of what you can achieve when you align a nation behind a common and clear strategy. And I think we can learn from some of those examples that we currently compete against, so we see how effective they are. So thank you for that. It's great to have the opportunity to talk. It's, as I say, a very quick brush over what has been a very complex and challenging organisation and business repositioning for Air New Zealand, and so there's lots that I haven't mentioned, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that people may have. Thank you.
Well, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, depending on how long the answers are. Peter Cullen.
Doesn't Christchurch already suck off trade from that hub in Auckland anyway?
It does a little. We used to operate a Christchurch LA service, and for all the reasons I just described, as soon as I came into this role we stopped doing that because it made absolutely no sense at all. So we now all services out of Christchurch for those same reasons. We have one flight that comes in from Japan via Christchurch to Auckland, which is actually driven more from our air service agreement with Japan and an arrangement we have with Japan Airlines that requires that to happen. Otherwise we would fly that service direct into Auckland as well.
Yep, hi Rob. Just wondering, you talk about the value to New Zealand, obviously being New Zealand. For the average consumer, they're probably not aware of that. Yeah. Why hasn't New Zealand gone down the road of KiwiBank and sort of gone with New Zealand ownership, the profit staying here, keeping New Zealanders working, especially when you're facing Australian competitors here in domestic market?
Yeah, I think KiwiBank have actually done a tremendous job with doing that. We made a conscious decision, rightly or wrongly, after the bailout of the airline, after the NSET failure and the government put money into the airline, we felt that we had to earn our credibility back again and build an airline that New Zealanders were proud of because they saw it as a genuinely world-class airline competing on the world stage, rather than one that they should support just because it is New Zealand's airline. We think we are at that stage now, and you will see us ramp up more and more the New Zealand versus Australian competitive dimension, and the creative team are having great fun with some of the